Good morning. My name is Michael Conley. I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Finance and Operations for North Reading Public Schools, and today I'm going to provide, in about 15 minutes or less, a quick overview of the school department's fiscal year 23 preliminary budget. These are the topics I am going to cover. I'm going to talk a little bit about the budget drivers and what's driving the school department's FY23 budget request. Then I'll get into the budget priorities and break down some of the numbers and compare how those compare to fiscal year 22, the current fiscal year's budget. I'll get into some of the new staffing positions that are being requested within the fiscal year 23 budget. I'll talk about some of the other budgetary offsets and special revenue, grant, federal and state grant, and offsets that are helping reduce the budget request, or the request to the local appropriation amount. And then I'll summarize by talking about conclusions of what the budget would achieve. So there are four main budget drivers, and it's not unusual that contractual salary obligations are probably the biggest budget driver of the school department's requests. We certainly, in a school department municipal budget, salaries do make up 83.5% of the total request. So when you have certainly obligations to meet fixed cost increases and cost of living adjustments and step increases for those staff on step, that's always going to be a big driver of the school department budget, and that's certainly the case next year as we look to prepare for the fiscal 2023 budget. And then we certainly have our operational fixed costs from looking at trying to fund utility increases and transportation increases and other contractual services increases for snow and ice needs and landscaping needs and other maintenance related operational needs of the school department. Those certainly have inflationary increases every year that we need to adjust the budget lines for. So those are fixed costs, but it's built into the budget. The third major request driver is staffing positions driven by changes and increases to enrollment, as well as new positions driven by our strategic plan, which is known as NRPS 2025. So we're certainly looking like we need to make increases given that the elementary enrollment is going up. In particular, there's been a high demand for full-day kindergarten, so we need to certainly add some positions to maintain optimal class sizes, or class sizes within our guideline of 18 to 22 students. When we look at our NRPS 2025 requests, I'll get into this more in detail, but we certainly have requests driven by our strategic plan. And then, as always, it seems to be the case, our special education costs, which is certainly costs to fund both our in-house special education programs as well as to fund out-of-district costs for students that are attending school outside the district, and there's tuition and transportation costs that go along with that. We do have needs driven by special education costs. Mainly, there's an increase in the students that are being educated outside the district next year, from currently at 28 to 31 students next year. So there's a cost that goes along with that. And the district also continues to commit to maintaining specialized in-house programs and a commitment to, when necessary, reallocate staffing to these areas to, when appropriate, educate students within the district. So there's certainly some costs associated with special education. When we get into the numbers and how it compares towards fiscal year 22, you can see that the staffing, the salary increases in these five major categories are going up by 4.5%. a little over 1.5 million when compared to fiscal 22. So that's the largest driver, as I mentioned in the slide earlier. And what's really driven behind that increase is both our contractual salary obligations, which account for about 2.7% of that 4.6% increase. Then we have increases due to our enrollment increases, particularly in the primary grades at the elementary level and in the full-day kindergarten program, which is accounting for maybe a little less than 1% of that 4.6% increase. And then we have another, 1.1%, which is driven by additional positions, which I'll get into in detail more a little bit later in this presentation, driven by our strategic plan. As you can see, our instructional expenses, no major changes there. Most of those accounts have been level funded. Our fixed cost increases, which I spoke of a moment ago, being a driver, there's some modest increases there. And then when we get into our special education tuitions and transportation, there's some increases on that end, which account for another about 0.6%, which is how we get to an increase of a little over $1.8 million, or 5.3% over fiscal year 22. So if you look at these major categories of how the funds are being spent, I mentioned earlier, it's not unusual to see salaries and compensation make up for 83.5% of our total budget. We then have special education outside tuitions making up 5.2%, followed by our contractual services, which are 4.2%, and that can be mainly contractual services for operational maintenance areas to maintain and upkeep the facilities, from heating, HVAC, cooling, plumbing, boiler repair, wastewater treatment plant operation. Those don't get cheaper every year. They certainly go up from year to year, and there's a cost to maintain those areas. Those are the major cost allocation areas. If you look at it in these categories, the functional categories, instructional services, which is cost to educate the students, that would fall in the 2000 series. For teaching and learning, certainly make up the highest percentage, as it always should, at 77%. We then have the operations and maintenance areas. That's the utilities would fall under that area, as well as our other contractual services that I just spoke of, is the next highest category at 9.4%. Our out-of-district tuition costs are at 5.2%, and then other initiatives for student services. This would be nursing and health services, other areas to provide tutoring and extra support in the student services area is at 4.8% of our total budget. If you get into our priorities in terms of what are our new staffing positions, I mentioned on an earlier slide we had enrollment-driven increases at the elementary level, as enrollment is going up by about 30 to 40 students at the elementary level next year, where the middle and the high school are staying relatively stable. So you have increases both at the grade level positions to maintain class sizes in that 18 to 22 area. And then we did have our kindergarten enrollment going up by over 20 students next year, for families desiring participation in the full-day kindergarten program. So to meet that demand, to offer full-day kindergarten for all families desiring such, and provide the paraprofessional support for enrollment of class sizes of generally 18 or more, we would need an additional teaching position and 2 additional paraprofessional positions. This is a total of 4 new positions, or a little over $207,000 to the operating budget. The other driver I mentioned earlier was an NRPS 2025 strategic plan driven focus, which certainly, as was the case last year and continues to be the case as we project forward, COVID-19 and impact of the pandemic is driving a lot of these initiatives. There's certainly a need for additional school adjustment counseling and to provide the mental health support really across the district, but this elementary position would allow for additional support in that area. Right now there's only one school adjustment counsel that's shared amongst our 3 elementary schools. This would allow for 2 counselors to be shared amongst the 3 schools as opposed to just one. We have a need for our teaching learning coordinator, which has been a part of our strategic plan for a number of years and unfortunately has not been able to be funded. But there's a need to address and align the curriculum across the district and to bring additional support for supervision and evaluation needs. And this has been part of that curriculum and leadership kind of realignment that's been part of the vision for a number of years. Next request is for 3 academic interventionists. The word upgrade is used because currently at the elementary level there's 3 kind of non-professional status tutor positions that are only 15 hours per week at each elementary school, and we really are seeing a need to upgrade those positions to professional teaching positions that are there for 35 hours a week that can really help with our multi-tiered system of support program and our intervention strategies, and to address areas of concern of learning loss, particularly in the areas of literacy and math, and that the need is ever so heightened by the COVID-19 pandemic over the last 2 years. So this is both a request for the elementary schools and the middle school to have access to these academic interventionists. Total request in this area is for additional 5.5 positions at a little over $381,000, which I mentioned before was a little over about 1.1% of our total 5.3% budget request. This slide is really meant to be a reminder that these are positions that we currently have now in fiscal year 22, and they're being funded outside of the operating budget through our ESSER grant program, which began in fiscal 21. And we do have funding that would be available through fiscal 24, so not only this year but through the next 2 fiscal years. And we do have 2 school adjustment counselors, one at the middle school and the high school, one at the elementary schools. We have some digital learning technicians that are helping support the one-to-one environment throughout the district. And then we have access to an additional floater school nurse that was certainly been very valuable over the last 2 years, and we see that need being there into the future. If you look at our summary of our budget, the general fund request is a little over $36 million requests, about a $1.8 million increase. We also have funding with positions being funded in our grants or other expenses being offset and through our federal and state grants and our revolving or special revenue accounts, which total a little more than $3.4 million, or in total, all school department funding is really in the $39.5 million range. And then that doesn't tell the full story because we still have school committee accepted donations, which the annual average has been about $250,000. And then we have our PTOs have their own budgets who help run enrichment programs and other events and field days and speakers and supplies and teacher classroom materials needs, which total about $75,000 annually. So when you look at our expenditure by source of funds, so certainly the general fund, which is what's appropriated through town meeting and paid for mainly by local property taxes, it makes up the largest piece of the puzzle. But certainly in excess of $3 million, we have our revolving funds, which I spoke of earlier, and then there's a little bit smaller piece of that is federal and state grant, which is the light orange piece, part of the bar at the bottom. And then we have our Chapter 70 state aid, which is about $7 million, which is the dotted kind of triangular line. And then we have the amount that we're required to spend as part of the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education's requirements, and then which is at 27 to 28 million, and then we, as you know, spend a little bit more than that as we look into the future. So here's our offsets, just really quickly. This is just kind of summarizes the money that we're taking in by a lot of these tuition-based programs and optional user fee-based programs. So they all work to directly offset the costs within those programs. And this kind of gives you an indication of what the user fee contribution amount is. So a lot of that user fee contribution, because these costs don't get cheaper from year to year, they only go up, has gone down. At one point, a lot of these percentages were all at 50%, but you now see the user fee bus is about 28%, athletics are around 40%, the extracurricular performing art programs are still in that 45-50% range, kindergarten we're at 45%, preschool we're about 40%. All in all, we're taking in about a little over $3 million, as I mentioned earlier, and it's about a 40% kind of offset by these special revenue accounts. Some history of our operating budget. We're asking for a 5.3% budget increase in terms of our recommended preliminary budget. We did receive 5.2% last year. Historically, we've been less than that. The 10-year average increase we've received to support the operating budget by the town has been about 3.65%. So in closing, what does this budget support? It's an FY23 budget that allows us to meet, first and foremost, our contractual obligations and those salary obligations with our employees and our employee unions. Allows us to meet fixed operational cost increases for busing and utilities and other maintenance areas. It does add staff to allow us to maintain sound class sizes and student-teacher ratios at the elementary level. It enhances academic support systems to address areas of learning loss, to ensure that we're taking really a proactive approach with learning intervention strategies. That's the academic interventionist positions. Allows us to maintain health and safety services for all students. That's the maintaining the school nursing position, and addresses social, emotional, and mental health needs for all students. So that's the additional school adjustment counseling position and maintaining those positions through the ESSER funding that have been ever so important during certainly these challenging years. And then with the curriculum leadership position, and the teaching and learning position, administrative position, it helps us to address that leadership model within the district. That's been part of the vision. That's really been part of what the administration and Teachers Association has had. And this will allow us to support all educators in the curriculum instruction and assessment strategies. Continues the one-to-one program, K through 12. Provides us with the necessary continuation of expenses for proper sanitation, health, and technology needs and software needs in this kind of post-COVID-19 learning environment. And then it does allow us to maintain and meet our operational costs to maintain all 5 schools and campuses. So that's what the FY23 budget would accomplish. Where do we go from here? We're going to continue to have on conversations with finance planning team, chairs and vice chairs of all the major boards and committees within the community. We are going to do a budget webinar on the 25th of March. The school budget hearing will take place on April 11th. The school committee is due to vote on May 2nd. Annual town meeting will be held probably in mid-June. We'll continue to await the actions of the state budget, and then we'll continue to solicit feedback and discuss the FY23 budget as we move forward throughout this process. So that completes my presentation. I hope you learned a little bit about what's part of the FY23 budget requests by the school department, and there'll be several opportunities to get involved over the next several weeks as we discuss the budget publicly with the school committee and various stakeholders as we move forward. Thank you for your time today.